Deep in the woods around Fouke, Arkansas, people have reported something strange moving through the timbers for generations. Most know it as the Fouke Monster, a towering Bigfoot-like creature said to roam the dark river bottoms. But what if we misunderstood it? What if those strange knocks in the night aren't meant to frighten you? What if they're a warning? Tonight's story begins with two friends, an isolated hunting cabin, and three knocks from somewhere deep in the woods. So turn down the lights, settle in, and listen closely. Because if you ever hear three knocks after dark, don't answer. This is the Fouke Warning, a Swamp Horror Story original. And while you're listening to the story, be sure and hit that subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment if you can. And remember, most importantly, hit that bell so you'll be notified when I upload any future videos, which happens weekly. And now we'll start the story. People around Fouke, Arkansas have been telling stories about something in the woods for longer than I've been alive. Most call it the Fouke Monster. Some call it Bigfoot. And some of the older folks, well, they won't call it anything at all. They'll just look toward the tree line, lower their voice, and tell you, if you hear three knocks after dark, don't answer it. I always figured that was just another story until the night something knocked back. My name is Daniel Mercer, and this happened about 12 years ago. A friend of mine named Earl owned 40 acres outside of Fouke, not far from the Sulphur River bottoms. Most of the property was thick timber, pine, oak, sweet gum, and patches of swampy ground where you could sink past your ankles if you weren't careful. Earl didn't live there. He inherited the land from his grandfather and mostly used it for hunting. There was an old one-room cabin on the property that his grandfather built sometime in the 1960s. There was no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, two bunks, a table, and an old screened porch. One October weekend, Earl asked if I wanted to spend a couple of nights there. I agreed. That decision still bothers me. We arrived Friday afternoon and spent several hours clearing brush around the cabin. Everything seemed normal until Earl found the first track. It was beside a muddy ditch about 70 yards behind the cabin. At first, I thought somebody had been trespassing. Then I saw the size of it. It looked like a bare human footprint, except it was nearly twice the length of my boot. Earl crouched beside it. "That's fresh." I laughed. "Somebody's messing with us." Earl didn't laugh. He pointed toward the trees. There was another print, then another. They disappeared into the timber. I wanted to follow them. Earl refused. Grandpa used to talk about tracks like these. That caught my attention. "What'd he say?" Earl stood. He said, "Leave them alone." That evening, we cooked supper outside and sat around a small fire. Around 9 o'clock, the woods became strangely quiet. There was no insects, no frogs, there was nothing. Earl noticed it too. Then we heard something walking beyond the firelight. One step, a pause. A few leaves crunched, another pause. It sounded heavy. I grabbed my flashlight. Earl whispered, "Don't." Naturally, I turned it on anyway. The beam swept across the trees, but I could see nothing. Then I caught movement. Something dark passed between the two pines. It was tall, very tall, but it disappeared so quickly I couldn't tell what I'd seen. Earl stood. "Inside." This time I listened. We went into the cabin and locked the doors. About 20 minutes passed. Then we heard a knock. I looked at Earl. Another knock came from somewhere outside. then a third. And it wasn't on the cabin, it came from the woods. 3 perfectly spaced knocks. Earl's face went pale. My grandpa told me about that. Before I could ask what he meant, something answered from the opposite side of the cabin. We heard 3 more knocks. Whatever made the second set of knocks was much closer. Neither of us slept much. Around midnight, something walked around the cabin. Slowly. We could hear leaves crunching beneath its feet. Every few minutes it stopped beneath one of the windows, then moved again. At approximately 2 in the morning, the footsteps disappeared. We waited until daylight before opening the door. That's when we discovered something strange. There were tracks all around the cabin, huge, barefoot tracks, but they never came onto the porch. It was almost as though whatever had been outside knew exactly where the cabin began and deliberately kept its distance. Earl wanted to leave. I convinced him to stay one more night. I wish I hadn't. That afternoon we followed an old logging trail toward the back of the property. About a mile from the cabin we found something hanging from a tree. An old metal tag, rusty, almost completely covered by moss. Stamped into it were the words, Mercer Lumber Company, 1968. That was my last name. Mercer. I stared at Earl. Did you put this here? He shook his head. I never told Earl much about my family. My grandfather had worked timber somewhere in southern Arkansas when he was young, but I never knew exactly where. We continued down the trail. That's when we found the foundation. Only a chimney and several concrete blocks remained. Someone had once lived there. Beside the chimney was an old rusted coffee can. Inside were several glass bottles, a pocket knife, a photograph sealed inside a plastic bag. The photograph showed 5 men standing beside a logging truck. I recognized one of them immediately. It was my grandfather. On the back, someone had written, Fouke, in October 1968. Underneath that was another sentence. We shouldn't have followed it. We returned to the cabin before dark. I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. My grandfather had died when I was 16. He never once mentioned Fouke. That night, Earl finally told me something his grandfather had said. In 1968, several timber workers claimed they had encountered a huge, hairy creature near the river bottoms. At first they thought it was a bear. Then they saw it walking upright. The men followed it for nearly 2 miles. Eventually they reached an area where the trees had been pushed down and woven together into strange walls. That's when one of the men disappeared. His name was Samuel Price. Search parties never found him. The official story came back as he had become lost and drowned. But Earl's grandfather believed something else happened. What? I asked. Earl stared at the fire. He thought there was more than one creature. Just then, we heard a knock. We froze. From deep in the woods, 3 more knocks. Then silence. Earl whispered, "We're leaving." Before we could move, something crashed through the brush behind the cabin. Branches snapped. Something enormous was running toward us. We rushed inside. A few seconds later, the footsteps stopped, right outside. The cabin shook slightly. I could hear breathing, deep, slow. Then something scraped along the exterior wall. Earl pointed toward the window. A shadow moved past it. The top of the head was nearly level with the upper window frame. Whatever stood outside had to be at least 7 feet tall. Then it did something I'll never forget. It spoke. Not words, but something close. A low, guttural sound. almost like someone trying to imitate human speech. Then it slammed its hand against the wall once, twice, 3 times, and ran. But it wasn't running toward the woods, it was running toward something else. Seconds later, we heard another sound, a scream. High-pitched, terrible. Not human, not any animal I've ever heard. Then the woods erupted. Trees shook, branches snapped. Something enormous crashed through the darkness, and suddenly everything went silent. We left at sunrise. About half a mile down the road, I noticed something standing beside the trees. It was tall, dark brown, broad shoulders, long arms. It stood perfectly still. I stopped the truck. Earl grabbed my arm. Don't. But I couldn't look away. The creature wasn't threatening us. It was watching us leave. Then it raised one arm and pointed toward the road, as if telling us, go. I drove. We never returned to the cabin. Earl sold the property several years later. But that's not where the story ends. After that weekend, I started researching my grandfather's past. Eventually, I found an old newspaper clipping from November 1968. The headlines read, "Local logger missing near Sulphur River." The missing man was Samuel Price. But underneath the photograph were the names of the 4 men who last saw him. One of those names belonged to my grandfather. I contacted my grandmother and asked her about it. She became quiet. Then she told me something I'd never heard before. My grandfather used to wake from nightmares. Sometimes he'd stand at the bedroom window staring into the darkness, and occasionally he would say, "It wasn't chasing us." I asked what he meant. My grandmother said she never knew. But one night, shortly before he passed, she finally asked him what had happened in Arkansas. He told her. "We thought the big one took Samuel." Then he shook his head. "We were wrong." "What took him?" she asked. My grandfather wouldn't answer. He only said, "The big one tried to warn us." 3 months after my trip to Fouke, something happened at my house. I lived nearly 200 miles away. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke to a sound outside my bedroom. A knock. I sat up. Another knock. Then a third. It wasn't coming from my door. It was coming from the woods behind my house. I walked to the window. At the edge of the trees stood something enormous. Tall, broad, covered in dark hair. Even from that distance, I knew what I was looking at. It was the creature from Fouke, Arkansas. It stood there for several seconds, then slowly lifted one arm. But this time it wasn't pointing toward the road. It was pointing behind me, toward my house. I turned around, and from somewhere underneath the floor, something scratched 3 times. That's when I finally understood the creature hadn't followed me from Fouke. Something else had. And whatever lives in those Arkansas woods may be the only thing keeping it from getting inside. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please join us again next week when the legend of Amos Moses will drop. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and God bless. Remember, stay out of those woods, stay out of those swamps, and keep your feet dry.